Chapter 3. By all the gods, is this the brave and noble Prince Alban I see before me? Or are my eyes deceived by some kind of trick? Bargar the warlord laughed as he surveyed the two men who had been quite easily captured by his own forces. They were staring back defiantly at him, but he knew the look of defeat in a captive's eyes, and it pleased him to see the same look in the eyes of his prisoners. "No, your eyes are seeing quite clearly," Alban answered, cursing himself for being this easily captured. They were on the borders of their own kingdom now, it being 2 weeks since they had parted ways with Valerie. All the while they had been heading along as quickly as they could, and by the time they'd reached the borders of Elgon, they were almost too weary to continue. He and Tyrus had set out in the forest to hunt, leaving Chardon behind to make camp. It was here that they were captured, caught up in a net which they failed to see hidden in the undergrowth. Then from out of the shadows of the trees, 24 armed men had sprung upon them. They fought back as best as they could, but there was no chance to escape. They'd been taken, stripped of their weapons, and shackled, taken to the fortress of the notorious Bargar, a one-time bandit who had slowly built up his own villainous little domain on the border. Now this villain and his small army, all men who had hated King Mildar, were looting and killing any who were foolish enough to travel or settle in what Bargar called his empire. "I often wondered when I'd run into you," Alban continued. "It's high time you and your hive of criminal scum were taken care of." The bandits all roared with laughter, as did their leader, who was busy amusing himself and playing with Alban's royal sword. "Is that so? Then why, may I ask, is your old drunkard of a king so frightened of us? We smite and pillage as we please, and he remains shut up in his filthy little castle. And they say he is a better ruler than me. Ha! What nonsense!" "My father has many duties," Alban replied. "If he has not seen to you yet, it can only be because he does not consider you at all a great threat." "Shut up. Mildar is a pathetic swine, whose throne is not worthy to even look at, and you are nothing more than a piece of hog shit. A brat who thinks he's some kind of hero. Don't make me laugh. And you," he turned to Tyrus. "You. Hell, I don't even care who you are. Get rid of him, Castle." A sinister-looking man stepped out from behind Bargar, and with one quick motion, thrusted his sword into Tyrus' chest. Alban screamed in anger, and tried his utmost to fight back. But it was in vain. The bandit chief turned towards him with a menacing grin. "That," he said, glaring at Alban, "is what will happen to you if your father does not pay the ransom for your release. 200,000 in gold, and control over 1/3 of the kingdom, or else his darling little boy will get hacked to pieces." The men all laughed loudly, and Alban was dragged off into the fortress's holding cells, cursing at his stupidity, his vain lust for adventure, which had led all of his friends, and possibly even himself, to their deaths. Almost all of them, actually. Chardon, who was never much good at hunting, had remained to look after the camp. He didn't like to be left alone, though, so after making sure the camp was in order, he set off in the direction of the others. He hadn't gone far, when to his great dismay, he heard the sounds of fighting. Alban and Tyrus were yelling, and a dozen or more strange voices were screaming. He crept forward a little further, and was just in time to see his prince being held, led off as a captive. He should have gone after them. He knew it. He should have been as brave as the man whom he served, But he wasn't. He was just a boy, with very little experience in fighting, and his only job was to look after Alban's arms and belongings. Compared to living on the streets, this was a very noble life indeed, and he was immensely grateful to the prince for taking him out of his previous miserable circumstances, and giving him this opportunity to serve a man of royal blood. I owe Prince Alban my life, he thought to himself, still hiding in the forest. I should go after him, or at least find someone to help rescue him. If only... No. Wait, that would never work. Maybe. He sat for many hours, wondering what to do. As the day grew darker and his chances of remaining hidden grew smaller, the nearest friendly village was a day away, on foot, and he knew that the villagers would never dare attack the infamous warlord Bargar. The nearest Elgonite military encampment was much further, and Chardon would have to travel through many places that were infested with bandits, and some things even worse. The road back was safe, however, but there was no one in that direction who could be of any assistance. No one. Except her. I must try to find her and convince her to help, he thought. I know she's only a girl, but she's a bloody huge giant, too. Even Bargar has to be afraid of someone like her. So in the end, he set off, back along the route they'd been traveling the past few weeks. He knew his chances of finding Princess Valerie were small, but he had almost no hope that she would even be willing to help him if he did. But it was his only option, so he decided to pursue it. In his excitement and eagerness to find the giantess, Chardon had forgotten completely that Vandan was now crawling with goblins. He had been traveling for 3 days and almost exhausted all his food and water, but he kept going. He forgot to be on the lookout for danger that was all around him. Now, he found himself surrounded by a score of goblins. The last faint traces of his courage had left him. I failed, he thought to himself. My master depended on me, but I failed him, and now both of us will die. I wish I could have seen my home again, all my friends too. But what would they think of me? A coward who led his companions to die. He began to cry, thankful that no one will ever see him in his deplorable condition. The goblins, who had been arguing amongst themselves in their strange goblin language, had finally decided to do with their prisoner. They planned to cut him into small pieces and divide the meat equally between them. The goblin leader raised his rusted sword, grabbed the boy by the hair, and yanked his head backwards. Chardon closed his eyes, and he felt the blow of the sword against his neck. He fainted from the intense pain, but he was still alive. The blunt sword only went a couple inches before the goblin chief dropped it. He and all the other goblins suddenly found themselves under attack. An enormous purple slipper came down above them and crushed half of them in one shot. The others began to flee, but they were too slow and found themselves squished by the giant feet within seconds. Valerie looked down at the carnage that she caused. She saw the tiny form of a human amongst the bodies of the goblins, and bent down very carefully to pick him up. With a gasp of surprise, she saw that it was the boy she'd seen a few weeks ago, the one who had been traveling with the obnoxious prince. He was still unconscious, and the blood was flowing copiously from his wound. She took out her water bottle and rinsed his wound, but didn't touch him for fear of injuring him further. The cold water gushing over Chardon's body revived him. His vision was terribly blurry, but he still recognized the giant face looming over him, and he was no longer afraid of her. He heard her soft voice telling him that it would be all right and that she was looking after him. But he did not care about his own condition. He had to tell her about Prince Alban and convince her to help him. Princess, he whispered so softly that she almost couldn't hear him. Please, help. My master. Captured. Hey, hold on a minute, little one. Let's get you feeling better first. I'm taking you back to my home. There must be some medicine or something there that can help you heal. No. I won't make it. Please. Help the prince. Here he coughed violently, and his wound began bleeding anew. He's prisoner in the fortress northwest. All right, that's enough. I'm not doing anything until I get you all up and able again. Listen to me. You're not going to die. Do you hear? She stared in horror as the tiny body stopped moving. For several minutes she kept attempting to revive him, but it was too late. His soul had left him, and she placed him carefully on the grass beside her, and then found herself beginning to cry. It was not the first time she'd seen a human die, but the death of this young boy, who only wished to help his master, seemed so unnecessary and pointless. If only she appeared on the scene a few moments earlier, he would have still been alive. Despite being upset about how Alban had treated her, Valerie still couldn't help thinking about him. She didn't believe at all it was possible that his kiss could have broken her curse if he hated her as much as he appeared to. She began to think that one more talk between them would help them get to know each other. So she set off in the directions she thought they went. And now he's been captured, she said to herself, after burying Chardon's body as best as she could. I can't say I'm surprised. He did seem rather short-sighted, I guess. Still, he did release me from the curse. I mean, there has to be something special about him, if he was able to do that. His servant boy even risked his own life to beg me to help him. Why would he do that if his master was not a good man? Well, I can sit here and think all I want, but that's not going to do any good. So I better get up and go. I hope you're ready, Prince Alban. Your princess is coming to save you, whether you want her to or not. Chapter 4. Valerie stood firmly in front of the bandits' fortress gates. The walls weren't even as high as her knees, but she did not invade the place yet. She didn't feel at all comfortable at the thought of killing other men, even if they were villainous robbers and murderers. She hoped there was a chance she could talk this whole situation through. In her hand she carried her weapon, a 40-foot tree she uprooted, and with which she hoped she would be able to fight without actually killing anyone. The men in the fortress below were scurrying about in panic. Many of them had longbows, but none of them fired at her. They were too completely overwhelmed by the presence of a 150-foot girl at their gates, and didn't know if they should attack her or run away. Suddenly she spoke, and every man in the courtyard, on the walls, and even inside, stopped moving. and listened to her very carefully. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she said loudly and clearly. "But I believe you are holding some men prisoner, and I want you to release them. Please, just let all your prisoners go and I'll leave." She was trying to think of what to say next when she heard a roar of laughter. It came from a man standing on the highest tower of the keep. He was clearly the leader of the bandits, since he was dressed in expensive robes and had a troop of bodyguards surrounding him. Valerie walked around the walls to get a better look at him. The tower was still less than half as high as she was, and she had to lean forward to hear what he was saying.
"Is this what that fool Mildar has sent to defeat me?" he said, still laughing. "An oversized damsel? How little he must think of his worthless dog of a son. Tell me, have you brought the gold I asked for, you hideous whatever you are?
"I don't know what you're talking about," Valerie said, feeling a strong urge to squeeze this nasty little villain until he began to cry. "I just want you to release Prince Alban and his companion, and any other innocent people whom you are holding here. That is all. Oh, and please don't insult me again. You'll regret it."
You think I'm afraid of you, you overgrown whore? I have 150 men at my command, all of whom are as fearless as I am, and they would gladly cut you down in an instant. As for the prisoners you spoke of, we have only one such man here now, although he won't be alive much longer, I'm afraid. You see, I'm having quite a lot of fun torturing him." That was as far as Bargar got. At the word whore, Valerie had enough. She no longer worried about hurting people, especially if they were as horrible as this one. She stepped over the little wall, while the men below screamed and fled. With one swift movement, she knocked down the bodyguards surrounding Bargar, put her hand down in front of the villain, and gave him a flick with her finger, and he went off into the blue, his screams quickly dying as he flew out of sight. With their leader gone, it was every bandit for himself. Most of them decided to run away as quickly as they could, and they hurriedly threw open the gates and began to pour out into the courtyard. Some of the men on the walls decided to fight back. They drew their bows and fired a few volleys of arrows at the giantess. The arrows stuck harmlessly into her dress and glanced off the exposed skin of her face. She shielded her eyes, her only vulnerable spots, and waited for the firing to stop. Now it was her turn, and she swung her tree against the walls, brushing the men off as they were dust. Next she swept the ground beneath her, where a few men had been trying to attack her feet with swords and spears. They too were caught up in the branches of the tree, and were flung into the air with great speed. Within minutes, the bandits had all either fled or were lying around injured and helpless. Some had even been killed. Only Bargar's bodyguard, including his right-hand man Castle, remained standing, on top of the central tower. They had brought out a ballista, quickly let loose a bolt on the giantess. It hit Valerie in the stomach, and caused her no greater discomfort as if she'd been poked. She raised her club above her head and brought it down with all her might next to the men. They fell to the floor from the shock, and their ballista was smashed into tiny splinters. She raised the tree again, but this time, one of the men in the group cried out for mercy. "Enough!" he begged her. "We surrender! Don't kill me, please! I'll do anything you ask!" He threw down his sword as his companions followed suit. Only Castle remained defiant, but one look at the giant maiden's wrathful face convinced him he was on the losing side.
He cast away his weapons and threw himself flat on the floor like the others. Valerie looked down at her defeated foes, glad that it didn't take long to end this. She hadn't enjoyed the battle at all, and now only wished to free her prince and anyone else who was unfortunate enough to be imprisoned here. She told her request to the men, who rushed off at once to see it through. As it turned out, Alban was indeed the only living survivor currently held by the bandits. They brought him up to the tower, and Valerie gasped at how awful he looked. He was wearing only a rag around his hips, and his body had been beaten and whipped all over. His handsome face was bruised and bleeding, and he could barely stand. She picked him up very gently and stashed him in the pocket of her dress. He just looked at her dazedly and hadn't spoken. The bandits also gave her all of his clothes and weapons, and these she put into her sack. "I really ought to punish you hard," she said to Castle and his few remaining men. "But I am in no mood for any further violence now. However, I will be staying in this region, and if I ever hear that you, or any of the others who ran away, have harmed anyone again, you'll be really, really sorry." With those words she left, leaving the bandits staring after her in wonder and fear. She threw the tree away, as well as her slippers, since they'd been severely damaged in battle and stained with the blood of all the men she accidentally crushed. Now barefoot, she headed off into the surrounding forests, away from her own home. It was now almost sunset, and she had to find a safe place for the two of them to sleep. Eventually, she found a clearing among the trees, which was just large enough for her to lie down in. She lay down at her side and placed her tiny companion gently on the grass before her. She rummaged around in her bag for some food, which she then offered to Alban. But he was in no condition to do anything, and he merely sat up and looked at her incredulously. At long last, after Valerie had grown tired of trying to engage him in conversation, he uttered a single word. "Why?" Upon hearing this, she found she could no longer contain her frustration, and burst forth in an angry rant. "What?" she exclaimed, making Alban cower in fear. "Is that all you have to say? Your servant gave up his life so he can tell me about your predicament, and I risked my own life standing up to those horde of barbarians, and you can't even reply with a simple thank you? I killed all those men even though I absolutely hated it, and you just..." She began to cry loudly, making such a sound as Alban had never thought possible for a mere girl to make. He sat there miserably, shivering in the growing darkness, and felt a complete loss of what to do or say. The news that Chardon died, too, made him want to cry himself. He realized now for the first time how horribly great all of his mistakes had been. All of his friends had died, and it was because of him, for his desire for fame and glory. Now that he had been freed from certain death at the hands of Bargar, he almost wished himself back in that dungeon. "I should have been the one to die. Not any of them," he thought. "Especially not Chardon. He was only a boy." And yet he risked his life to find someone to help me. If only I accepted her help. He stood up and carefully approached the sobbing giantess. She didn't notice as he cautiously crept up to her hand, which was lying on the ground, and took hold of her 7-foot finger. Only when he spoke her name did she try to control her sobs. And when he spoke to her, she grew quieter and calmer. My lady, he began, not knowing how else to address her. I would ask you to forgive me, and to forgive all the despicable things I've said and did. But we both know I don't deserve it. I may be a prince, but that doesn't make me noble or worthy of respect. I've done nothing noble with my life, and I have caused others to lose theirs. I deserved what Barger and his men did to me. That's not true. It is true. You saved my life, princess, even though my behavior has been all but chivalrous. No, I'm not worthy to be treated like royalty. I should have listened to my friends, but I was too proud, vain, stupid, and now they're dead because of me. Why should my fate not be the same? Because, Valerie interrupted before pausing. She didn't know why she was saying this, only that it felt right in her heart. Because I love you. Alban froze and looked into her eyes. Did he just hear what he heard? Why would she say such a thing? How could she not hate him after all the misery he'd caused her? Princess, I don't know what to say. He fell speechless as she wrapped 4 fingers around his bruised body and lifted him effortlessly. She sat up and brought him right up to her face, so close that her lips, he could almost reach out and touch him. I don't know why, she whispered, and her breath washed over him like a wave. But I couldn't stop thinking about you, even after you'd left me. And I was so upset by your behavior that I tried to convince myself that you weren't the one who freed me. But you were. You did save me. And it must have been because you loved me. I mean, how did you feel when you kissed me the first time? Did you feel anything for me in that one moment? I did feel. I can't describe it, but I was drawn to you. I couldn't take my eyes off of you. But then I grew to my original size. Did that change the way you felt about me? Am I no longer the same girl who lay in the bed? The same girl whose allure you felt so strongly? Do you no longer love me, simply because I have changed in size? Tell me, Alban. Please tell me how you feel. He began, but said no more. In a moment of passion, he pulled himself upwards, out of her grip, and reaching for her nearby lips, pressed his upper body against them. She immediately responded, parting her lips slightly so that she can let her tongue glide over his body. Alban went completely numb. He hadn't eaten for days, and his strength was almost gone. Right then, he didn't want to do anything except relax and let her giant lips and tongue touch him and soothe him. However, he still had enough strength in him to say the one thing he'd been meaning to say all evening. My princess, Valerie, would you accept me if I told you that I loved you? Yes. Yes, she replied immediately, kissing him more passionately than before. His miniature body felt almost weightless in her hand, so small and delicate, a mere insect in comparison to her. And yet, she knew he was the man she was in love with. Despite all of his flaws, she didn't want him to be any other person than who he was right now. She now knew his true character, and she was glad she hadn't abandoned him to his death. From now on, she would be his protector, his companion, and his lover. She laid him down gently in her lap and removed his ragged clothing. He didn't object as she opened her water bottle and poured clean water on him. She rubbed him softly with her fingers, washing away all of the dirt and blood. She then tore off a piece of cloth at the end of her sleeve and wrapped it around him. She then let him drink from her cupped hand, and she gave him enough food to help him recover from his ordeal. You see, she said, after he had eaten and drunk, and she had wrapped her fingers around him again. I'm not such a monster after all. He stared up at her, and even in the night's darkness, found her extremely beautiful to look at. Once again, he felt ashamed at how he had treated her when they first met, and he begged her forgiveness. I am yours, my lady, he said, not looking into her eyes. Please forgive me. I didn't see you at first. Only the giant that I was told about in stories. But you're no such being. A monster. You are a beautiful woman. Beautiful in all the ways there can be. Please, do with me as you will. I will, my beloved prince. And I forgive you for everything that you regret. When tomorrow comes, you and I will begin our new life together. But for now, you need to rest. Sleep, Alban, my love. I'll watch over you. She lay down on her back and folded her hands across her chest. Right next to her heart, Alban slept, feeling more whole and fulfilled than he had ever felt before. All throughout the night, he fell asleep to the rhythm of her gigantic heartbeat. He had never in his wildest dreams imagined that his true love would be a giantess like Valerie. But in the end, he was glad that she was.